things. You even referred to 9/11. I mean, we could have anticipated that, and you talk about the government being well aware of Project Bojinka. Now, you've covered some of this before, but I think we've got a lot of new listeners. In fact, we have younger listeners. So maybe tell us a little bit about 9/11 and why there's really something ratty about that. They claim it was a terrorist attack. We weren't aware of it and so forth. Speak to our listeners about that.
Sure. I had two books also coming from Southwest Radio Church on that subject. My first book was September 11 Prior Knowledge, and it was followed by the book Cover Up, and that's the one in which I also mentioned Saddam Hussein's secret strategy before the Iraq War began. But the 9/11 Prior Knowledge, I think, was the first book written on the subject. It was the first one out. And I try to use information that's credible and little known. For example, the prior knowledge is not to say that George W. Bush conducted this operation, but they certainly had knowledge that could have led to an easy prevention. For example, on August 6th, President Bush was given an internal briefing document that was titled Osama bin Laden determined to strike in the U.S. or inside the U.S. Now, they thought the attack was originally probably going to be somewhere else in Europe, but they at least knew in advance that it might be. And earlier in that summer, they had information that had been published about Project Bojinka, and that was a project planned by the terrorists, as we later found out, to hijack planes and crash them into the World Trade Center and other prominent buildings, including the Transamerica building. They didn't choose that one ultimately, but in several major buildings. So the idea is, if you're Condoleezza Rice and you're in charge of national security, she kept saying, well, we didn't have actionable intelligence. Well, that's not the job of a national security advisor. The national security advisor is supposed to anticipate possibilities and develop contingency plans. And so even if one of your listeners had been national security advisor, once they learned of this information about a possible attack in the U.S., you would have sat there with a number of consultants working for you, and you'd say, well, where might they attack? And immediately the World Trade Center would have come to mind, because they'd already tried to blow that up back in 1993. And then you would have said, okay, how do we prevent various attacks? What if it's a sarin gas attack? What if it's a truck bomb? And at some point you would have said, well, what if it's an air attack? And somebody would have said, well, what kind of? We don't know. And so you would develop a contingency for any kind of air attack. And the simple answer would be an Apache Longbow helicopter. There's at least 3 forts in the New York City area, and at least 1 or 2 of them have these Apache Longbow helicopters, which have 30-millimeter chain guns. They have rockets, and they have a missile. And you wouldn't need to actually put that helicopter by the World Trade Center or have it flying around all the time. You just have it on standby alert. So if anything peculiar was going on, as it was that morning, they knew in advance of the planes hitting that there were certain things that might be ominous, lack of communication with certain planes and so on. You would just pick up the phone and say, send up the Apache, and it would have taken only a couple of minutes for that to be right there next to the buildings. And as the planes were coming at it, it would have been the simplest thing in the world to knock them out of the sky with the rockets and the missile. And they would say, oh, well, you would just kill those people? Well, in the first place, those people were going to die anyway, unfortunately. And if a plane going 500 miles an hour is headed right for the World Trade Center and you're there in your helicopter, chances are really big that they're not just a bunch of tourists off track. And so, yes, it would have amounted to killing those people, but you would also have been saving the lives of 3,000 people. So, these are difficult decisions, but still, the attacks could have easily been prevented. So that's one way. Now, about the foreknowledge, what I try to do that's different than most writers is most people would say, well, Willie Brown, the mayor of San Francisco, was flying to New York City that morning. It was a Tuesday morning, flying to New York City that morning, and he got a late-night warning about his plane flight. And so Willie Brown comes on and says, well, yeah, I got a warning, but everybody assumed it was one of these general FAA warnings that they put out fairly frequently. And then that story just went away. Well, what I did, unlike others, is I filed a Freedom of Information request with the FAA, and they wrote back that there was no general warning for at least 2 weeks before 9/11. So he had to get some special information. So the question should have been, who did he talk to? Who actually called him? And how did they have this information? And so what I do is I take it another step forward. And so I saw in Newsweek magazine that a reporter named Hosenball on, I believe it was the day after 9/11, had a column in Newsweek, and it was a very brief little item, and it said top Pentagon officials had suddenly canceled their travel plans the morning of 9/11, and that was it. And so I called him up. And I asked him some questions, and very quickly he started to get very sort of scared. He said, I don't want to talk about it. I can't. I'm not going to talk about this anymore. And so that was it. And so I called up his editor, Evan Thomas, who was editor of Newsweek for the Washington area, and he said, well, what did Hosenball say? Like, he was wondering what he had spilled. And I said, well, he just, said, I can't talk about it. And he starts laughing. Evan Thomas, head of Newsweek, just starts laughing. And I said, oh, really? Like that. And then, sure enough, about 9 days later, they come out with the same information, similar. Now, I'm thinking that if you're the Pentagon and you see in Newsweek that 5 or several of your top officials has canceled their plans, you're going to think you might be under a microscope on this thing. And so if it's false, immediately when Hosenball's story appeared, you would call up and say, what are you guys doing? No top Pentagon officials canceled their travel plans. We want a retraction. So obviously 9 days later, if they're still printing the same information, it means it's correct. So I call up and I find out under another Freedom of Information request that there were 5 top Pentagon officials who suddenly canceled their travel plans. So I'm trying to figure out who. So what I find out is that the Pakistani head of ISI, which is their equivalent of the CIA, had 3 months before 9/11 been to Washington, and then suddenly, 2 weeks before 9/11, he comes back. His name is General Mahmoud Ahmad. And General Mahmoud Ahmad had $100,000 a month before 9/11 wired to Mohammed Atta, the ringleader of 9/11. So here he is suddenly showing up, and these guys suddenly canceled their travel plans for that morning.
Well, friends, I do want to underscore everything that Dr. Cuddy has said. We've had him on so many times. He is a historian and political analyst. He actually received a Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, very prestigious institution dealing with
the oldest state university in the nation.
Yes, and Ph.D. means more than a post hole digger. You certainly, anybody who gets a Ph.D. from them really deserves it. So Dr. Cuddy has taught at the university level. He's been a political and economic risk analyst for the for an international consulting firm, and has been a senior associate with the U.S. Department of Education. He does a lot of work with how they're dumbing down our school kids and actually twisting their minds. So we do want to.
I wrote the first draft of the first essay that President Reagan had published on education.
Right, I know. It's amazing. So we are offering this new book. It's titled Conspiracy. And Dr. Cuddy, several years ago, we had Dr. Paul Williams on. We were doing stuff on the American Hiroshima, and, there's a high likelihood